My name is Lindsay Parker, and the day my boss, Victoria Harmon, called me just an intern in front of the entire executive team was the same day I decided she needed to learn exactly who she was talking to. What she didn't know was that I wasn't just some college kid fetching coffee and making copies. I was the granddaughter of Thomas Parker, the man who had quietly owned 51% of Sterling Dynamics since its founding 23 years ago. A secret that was about to turn her perfectly ordered corporate world completely upside down. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday, at Sterling Dynamics. I arrived at 7:30, a full hour before most of the staff, clutching my usual vanilla latte and wearing the same navy blazer I'd been rotating for 3 months. The Austin skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our downtown office, casting long shadows across the marble lobby that always made me feel smaller than I already was. I badged in at the security desk, offering a polite smile to Marcus, the security guard who actually bothered to learn my name. Unlike most people in this building, he treated me like a human being instead of furniture that occasionally moved around and delivered documents. The elevator ride to the 15th floor was silent, except for the soft jazz that played on repeat, the same 3 songs I'd memorized during my 6 months as an intern at what was supposedly Austin's most innovative tech consulting firm. Sterling Dynamics occupied 3 floors of the Meridian Tower, with the executive offices claiming the prime real estate on 17. As an intern, I was relegated to 15, sharing a cramped workspace with 2 other summer interns who spent most of their time complaining about the coffee machine and planning their weekend social media posts. My desk sat in the corner, deliberately positioned where I could see everyone but remained largely invisible myself. Victoria Harmon had made it clear from day one that I was expendable. During my first week, she'd introduced me to a client as one of our temporary helpers, while standing right next to Brandon Walsh, the marketing coordinator she'd hired straight out of UT with a starting salary that probably exceeded what my family spent on groceries in 6 months. Brandon got invited to strategy meetings, client lunches, and after-work happy hours. I got asked to organize supply closets and update spreadsheets that nobody would ever look at. The irony wasn't lost on me. My grandfather Thomas had built this company from nothing, starting with a single client and a rented office space above a sandwich shop in 1998. He'd grown Sterling Dynamics into a multi-million-dollar operation that consulted for Fortune 500 companies across the Southwest. But Thomas Parker had always been a private man, preferring to remain in the background while others took credit for the success he'd orchestrated. Even after his death 2 years ago, most employees had no idea that the elderly gentleman who occasionally visited the office hadn't been just another consultant, but the majority owner of everything they saw around them. I'd discovered my inheritance purely by accident while helping my grandmother sort through legal documents after the funeral. Hidden in a manila folder marked business interests were stock certificates, transfer agreements, and a will that left me stunned. Thomas Parker hadn't just been successful in business, he'd been strategic. The 51% stake he'd accumulated over the years had never been disclosed to the executive team or board members, operating through a series of shell companies and legal trusts that kept his identity protected. My grandmother had pressed the documents into my hands with tears in her eyes. "Your grandfather always said this company would be yours someday," she'd whispered. "He wanted you to earn your place first, to understand the business from the ground up. But he never intended for you to be treated like this." "Like what?" I'd asked, not yet understanding the full scope of what was waiting for me. "Like you don't matter," she'd replied. "Like you're not family." The truth was, I'd applied for the internship at Sterling Dynamics without revealing my connection to the company. I'd wanted to prove myself on merit, to show that I belonged in the corporate world based on my skills and work ethic rather than family ties. My business degree from Texas State wasn't from an Ivy League school, and my resume didn't sparkle with prestigious internships or networking connections. I was just Lindsay Parker, a 22-year-old who'd worked retail jobs to pay for college and dreamed of making a difference in the business world. What I hadn't anticipated was how cruel that world could be to someone perceived as powerless. Victoria treated me like I was invisible most days, addressing me only when she needed something done immediately, or when I'd somehow failed to meet expectations I'd never been told about. She had a particular talent for public humiliation, calling out my mistakes in meetings where I was the only intern present, surrounded by executives who nodded along with whatever she said. Her favorite phrase was attention to detail, which she'd repeat while reviewing my work as if I were a child who couldn't be trusted with crayons. The other executives followed her lead. David Sterling, the supposed company founder who'd somehow forgotten to mention that he'd never actually owned more than 30% of the business, barely acknowledged my existence. When he did speak to me, it was usually to ask if I knew where his assistant had gone, or whether the conference room coffee needed to be refreshed. Amanda Cross from HR treated me with the kind of professional politeness reserved for vendors and delivery drivers, always friendly but never actually interested in anything I had to say. Brandon Walsh, meanwhile, seemed to exist in a completely different universe. Victoria praised his innovative thinking when he suggested social media, strategies that I'd seen on Pinterest the week before. She invited him to client presentations where he'd nod thoughtfully while contributing nothing substantial to conversations about market analysis and growth projections. During team lunches, he sat at Victoria's right hand, laughing at her jokes, and offering opinions on everything from quarterly targets to the best restaurants for entertaining clients. I ate lunch alone most days, usually at my desk while catching up on data entry or research projects that never seemed to lead anywhere. Sometimes I'd walk to the small park across the street, sitting on a bench with a sandwich from the building's cafeteria while watching other young professionals networking and building relationships that would define their careers. They looked confident, purposeful, like they belonged in the world of business suits and strategic planning. I felt like I was playing dress-up in clothes that didn't quite fit. The morning that changed everything started with Victoria calling an emergency meeting for 9 a.m. I'd been at my desk since 7:30, reviewing quarterly reports and preparing a presentation I'd been working on for 3 weeks. The presentation analyzed inefficiencies in our current client onboarding process and proposed solutions that could save the company approximately $40,000 annually. I'd spent evenings and weekends researching industry best practices, creating charts and graphs that clearly demonstrated potential improvements. At 8:55, I gathered my materials and headed to Conference Room C, the mid-sized meeting space where most departmental briefings took place. Victoria was already there, perfectly composed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. David Sterling sat to her left, scrolling through emails on his phone with the distracted air of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. Brandon occupied the chair directly across from Victoria, his laptop open and his expression focused in that performative way he'd perfected for important meetings. Amanda Cross arrived precisely at 9, followed by 2 other department heads I recognized but rarely interacted with. I took a seat near the back of the room, close enough to participate if called upon, but far enough away to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. My presentation materials sat in a neat stack in front of me, each page carefully organized and color-coded for maximum clarity. Victoria called the meeting to order with her usual efficiency. "We're here to discuss the Henderson Group proposal," she began, referencing the potential client that had been the focus of our department's efforts for the past month. "As you know, this represents a significant opportunity for expansion into the healthcare sector, with an estimated contract value of $2.5 million over 3 years. She gestured toward Brandon, who straightened in his chair like a student called on by his favorite teacher. "Brandon has been spearheading our approach strategy, and I'd like him to walk us through the proposal before we present to the Henderson team this afternoon." I felt my stomach drop. The Henderson Group proposal. The project I'd been working on since my second week at Sterling Dynamics. The client research, market analysis, and strategic recommendations that had consumed my evenings and weekends for the past month. The presentation I'd submitted to Victoria's assistant the previous Friday, along with a detailed implementation timeline and cost-benefit analysis. Brandon opened his laptop and began clicking through slides that looked remarkably familiar. The color scheme was different, and he'd added some stock photos of healthcare professionals looking thoughtfully at computer screens, but the content was unmistakably mine. The market research I'd compiled from industry reports, the competitive analysis I'd developed after reviewing similar consulting projects, the three-phase implementation strategy I'd outlined based on best practices from companies like McKinsey and Deloitte. He spoke with the confident delivery of someone who'd spent weeks mastering the material, explaining concepts and recommendations as if he'd developed them himself. The room listened attentively, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions that Brandon answered with ease. Victoria watched him with the satisfied expression of a mentor proud of her protégé's progress. I sat in stunned silence, watching, my work being presented by someone else while my actual contribution was completely erased. The research hours I'd spent in the library, the late nights I'd worked while my classmates were at parties, the careful analysis I'd conducted to ensure every recommendation was supported by solid data. All of it attributed to Brandon Walsh, who'd probably spent more time choosing fonts than understanding the actual content. When Brandon finished his presentation, Victoria turned to the room with a pleased smile. "Excellent work," she said, her voice warm with approval. "This demonstrates exactly the kind of innovative thinking that sets Sterling Dynamics apart from our competitors. Brandon, I want you to take the lead on this presentation this afternoon. You've clearly mastered the material." David Sterling nodded his agreement. "Impressive analysis," he said, still not looking up from his phone. "The healthcare sector represents significant growth potential." Amanda Cross chimed in with administrative details about the meeting logistics, discussing transportation arrangements, and presentation materials. The other department heads offered congratulations and strategic suggestions, treating Brandon like he'd just solved a complex puzzle through his own brilliance. Throughout this exchange, I remained invisible. No one asked for my input on the project I'd actually created. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. No one acknowledged the months of work that had gone into developing the strategy Brandon was now being praised for implementing. I was just another piece of office furniture, present but irrelevant to the important business being conducted around me. As the meeting began to wind down, I made a decision that would change everything. I raised my hand slightly, clearing my throat to get Victoria's attention. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I had a question about the implementation timeline." Victoria looked at me with the slightly irritated expression she reserved for interruptions. "What about it, Lindsay?" "Well, I've been working on the Henderson proposal since early last month, and I wanted to clarify some of the details Brandon presented. Specifically, the market analysis section seemed to incorporate research I'd submitted in my preliminary findings." The room fell silent. Brandon's confident expression faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly with a dismissive smile. Victoria's eyebrows raised in what could have been surprise or annoyance. "Lindsay," she said, her voice taking on the patient tone adults use with confused children. "I think there might be some misunderstanding here. Brandon has been leading this project from the beginning. You've been helping with some background research, which we certainly appreciate, but the strategic development and analysis have been Brandon's responsibility." I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but I pressed on. "I understand there might be some confusion, but I have documentation of the work I've submitted. The competitive analysis, the three-phase implementation strategy, even the specific cost projections. Those were all part of the materials I provided to your assistant last Friday." Brandon leaned forward slightly, his expression now showing what looked like genuine concern. "Lindsay, I think you might be overestimating your contribution here. We've all been collaborating on various aspects of this proposal, but the core strategy and presentation have been my focus for several weeks now." Victoria nodded, her expression hardening. "Brandon is correct. Lindsay, while we value the research, assistance you've provided, it's important to understand the difference between support work and strategic development. As an intern, your role is to help gather information and learn from the process, not to take credit for work that's been done by our permanent staff." The words hit me like a physical blow. Around the table, the other executives nodded along, apparently satisfied with this explanation. David Sterling had finally looked up from his phone, observing the exchange with mild interest, but no apparent concern for the accusations being made. "I think," Victoria continued, her voice now carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having the final word, "this is a good learning opportunity for Lindsay. In professional environments, it's crucial to understand scope of responsibility and to avoid overstepping boundaries. The work Brandon has done on this proposal represents exactly the kind of strategic thinking we expect from our team members." She turned back to Brandon, effectively dismissing me from the conversation. "Now, about this afternoon's presentation. Timing." I sat there feeling like the air had been sucked out of the room. Not only had my work been stolen, but I was being lectured about professionalism and boundaries by the very people who'd taken credit for my efforts. The research I'd spent weeks developing was being treated like simple data entry, and my attempt to clarify the situation was being characterized as inappropriate ambition from an intern who didn't understand her place. The meeting continued, around me, but I stopped listening. Instead, I found myself thinking about my grandfather Thomas, wondering what he would have said about this moment. He'd built Sterling Dynamics on principles of hard work and innovation, creating opportunities for talented people to contribute meaningfully to the company's success. Would he have recognized the organization his company had become, where politics mattered more than performance and credit flowed upward regardless of who'd actually done the work? As the executives filed out of the conference room, Brandon lingered near my seat. "Hey, Lindsay," he said, his voice carrying what sounded like genuine concern. "I hope there are no hard feelings about this. We're all working toward the same goals here." I looked up at him, studying his face for any sign that he understood what had just happened. But his expression was earnest, almost sympathetic, as if he genuinely believed that some kind of innocent misunderstanding had occurred rather than a deliberate theft of my work. "Sure," I said quietly. "No hard feelings." He smiled and headed toward the door, probably already mentally preparing for the afternoon presentation that would launch his career while further cementing my position as forgettable support staff. Victoria had already left, no doubt returning to her office to review other important matters that required her attention. The conference room was empty now, except for me and the evidence of what had just transpired. Brandon's laptop still displaying slides built from my research, the whiteboard covered with timeline notes I'd helped develop, and the lingering sense that something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of how this company operated. I gathered my unused presentation materials, the stack of carefully prepared documents that had been rendered irrelevant by Brandon's performance. Walking back to my desk, I passed the framed photos that lined the hallway showcasing Sterling Dynamics' history and achievements. There was David Sterling cutting the ribbon at the company's first major office expansion, Victoria accepting an industry award for client innovation, and various team photos from company retreats and milestone celebrations. In none of these photos did I see any trace of Thomas Parker, the man whose vision and investment had made all of these achievements possible. His contributions had been quietly erased from the company's public narrative, just as my contributions were being erased from individual projects. The pattern was becoming clear, and it had nothing to do with merit or professional development. It was about power, perception, and who got to tell the story of success. Sitting at my desk, I opened my laptop and stared at the screen without really seeing it. Around me, the office hummed with its usual activity: phones ringing, keyboards clicking, conversations about deadlines and client meetings. Everything looked normal, professional, productive. But underneath that surface, I was beginning to understand that Sterling Dynamics operated according to rules that had nothing to do with fairness or recognizing actual contributions. The question now was what I intended to do about it. I could accept my role as invisible support staff, content myself with learning experiences and networking opportunities that might eventually lead to a real position somewhere else. I could treat this as an unfortunate but educational introduction to corporate politics, the kind of story I'd tell years later about paying dues and earning my place in the business world. Or I could remember that my grandfather hadn't built this company so that talented people could be dismissed as just interns, while their work was stolen by others. He'd envisioned an organization where innovation and hard work were rewarded, where the best ideas succeeded regardless of who developed them. The documents hidden in my grandmother's safe suddenly felt like more than just legal papers. They were a reminder that sometimes the most powerful people in a room are the ones nobody thinks to pay attention to, and sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage you can have. The rest of that Tuesday passed in a blur of forced normalcy. I completed my assigned tasks with mechanical precision, updating databases and formatting reports, while my mind replayed the morning's events on an endless loop. Every time someone walked past my desk, I wondered if they'd heard about the meeting, if they knew that the intern had tried to claim credit for work beyond her capabilities. The thought made my cheeks burn with embarrassment that I couldn't quite shake, even though I knew I'd done nothing wrong. Around 3 o'clock, I watched through the glass conference room walls as Victoria, Brandon, and David Sterling prepared for the Henderson Group presentation. Brandon wore his best suit, the navy one he saved for important client meetings, and carried himself with the confidence of someone about to deliver career-defining work. Victoria reviewed documents with the focused intensity she brought to high stakes situations, occasionally gesturing toward charts and graphs that I'd spent countless hours perfecting. They looked like a team, professional, polished, ready to secure a multi-million-dollar contract that would cement Sterling Dynamics' reputation in the healthcare consulting sector. Nobody watching would guess that the strategic foundation of their presentation had been developed by the intern currently organizing supply closets on the 15th floor. I tried to focus on my afternoon assignments, but concentration felt impossible. Instead, I found myself cataloging other moments when my contributions had mysteriously vanished or been minimized. The market research report I'd compiled for the Jenkins Corporation project, which somehow became collaborative departmental analysis in the final client presentation. The efficiency recommendations I'd drafted for internal operations, later presented by Amanda Cross as HR-initiated improvements during a board meeting I wasn't invited to attend. Each memory felt like discovering a new bruise, tender spots I'd somehow learned to ignore until now. How many times had I convinced myself that this was normal, that interns were supposed to remain invisible while others claimed credit for their work? How many opportunities had I missed to speak up because I'd internalized the message that my voice didn't matter in these spaces? By 5:30, most of the office had emptied out. The Henderson presentation had apparently gone well, judging by the celebratory tone of the brief emails that circulated afterward. Victoria sent a message to the entire consulting team praising Brandon's exceptional preparation and strategic insight, with special recognition for his comprehensive understanding of the healthcare market landscape. Reading it felt like being punched in the stomach by someone wearing velvet gloves. I stayed late that evening, partly because I had legitimate work to finish, and partly because I wasn't ready to go home and pretend that everything was fine. The office took on a different character after hours, quieter and more intimate without the constant buzz of meetings and phone calls. Cleaning crews moved through the floors with efficient precision, emptying trash cans and wiping down surfaces while I sat at my computer, supposedly reviewing client files but actually staring into space. Around 7, I decided to take a walk through the building. I told myself I needed to stretch my legs and clear my head. But truthfully, I was curious about what the executive floors looked like when they weren't full of important people conducting important business. The elevator ride to 17 felt different without the pressure of a meeting or deadline waiting at the other end. The executive floor was elegant in a way that felt designed to intimidate. Rich mahogany paneling lined the hallways, and original artwork hung between doors marked with titles like Chief Executive Officer and Senior Vice President of Strategic Development. Everything was perfectly maintained, from the polished floors to the fresh flowers that appeared on reception desks twice weekly. Victoria's office occupied a corner space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of downtown Austin. Even from the hallway, I could see her awards and certificates displayed on the walls, along with photographs of her shaking hands with politicians and industry leaders. Her desk was immaculate, with documents arranged in precise stacks and a coffee cup that had been cleaned and returned to its designated spot. David Sterling's office was larger, but somehow less impressive. Where Victoria's space radiated controlled ambition, his felt like a stage set designed to convey success without much substance behind it. The bookshelf held leather-bound volumes that looked like they'd never been opened, and the artwork seemed chosen more for its expensive appearance than any aesthetic vision. Standing in that hallway, surrounded by symbols of achievement and authority, I felt the full weight of my invisibility. These people made decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in client relationships. They were quoted in industry publications and invited to speak at conferences. Meanwhile, I was the intern who fetched coffee and updated spreadsheets, someone so insignificant that my work could be stolen without consequence. But something else was stirring beneath that sense of powerlessness. A memory of my grandfather's voice, patient and thoughtful, explaining business concepts during family dinners when I was barely old enough to understand them. "Lindsay," he'd said once, "the most successful people in business aren't always the loudest or the most obvious. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody pays attention to." I'd been so focused on trying to earn respect through hard work and merit that I'd forgotten the larger truth about my situation. I wasn't just Lindsay Parker, the invisible intern struggling to prove herself worthy of basic recognition. I was Lindsay Parker, granddaughter of Thomas Parker, majority owner of the company that employed everyone who'd dismissed me today. The realization didn't bring immediate comfort. If anything, it made the situation more complex and painful. My grandfather had built Sterling Dynamics to be something better than what I was experiencing. He'd envisioned a company where talent was recognized and developed, where innovation came from encouraging diverse perspectives rather than silencing uncomfortable voices. Walking back to the elevator, I passed a conference room where someone had left the lights on and forgotten to clear the whiteboard. Notes from an earlier meeting remained visible, including a timeline for Q4 objectives and a list of key personnel for strategic initiatives. Brandon's name appeared multiple times, along with several other employees I recognized as Victoria's favorites. My name was nowhere to be seen, despite my involvement in many of the projects being discussed. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. This wasn't about my performance or potential. It was about a system that had decided who mattered and who didn't, often before the work itself had been evaluated. I could spend years trying to prove myself worthy of recognition, but the game was rigged in ways that had nothing to do with merit or contribution. That night, I drove home to my small apartment complex on the east side of Austin, a 20-minute commute that took me from the gleaming corporate towers downtown to a neighborhood of graduate students and young professionals trying to establish themselves in an expensive city. My one-bedroom unit was furnished with hand-me-down furniture and decorated with college posters I'd never gotten around to replacing. It felt like a temporary space, which matched how I'd been thinking about my entire life lately. I made dinner from whatever was available in my mostly empty refrigerator and sat at my small dining table with my laptop open, ostensibly to catch up on personal emails but actually to avoid thinking about the day's events. The silence in my apartment felt different from the productive quiet of an office after hours. This was isolation, the particular loneliness of realizing that your daily reality isn't sustainable, but not yet knowing what comes next. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a text from my college roommate Sarah, now working at a marketing firm in Dallas. "How's the corporate world treating you?" she asked, probably expecting the usual update about learning experiences and networking opportunities that I'd been sharing for the past 6 months. I stared at the message for several minutes, trying to figure out how to respond. The truth felt too complicated to explain in a text message, and I wasn't ready to admit to myself, let alone to Sarah, how badly things were going. Instead, I sent back something vague about learning a lot about office dynamics and promised to call her over the weekend. But lying to Sarah made me realize how much I'd been lying to myself. I'd spent months accepting treatment that I would never tolerate in any other context, convincing myself that this was normal professional development rather than recognizing it as systematic exclusion and exploitation. The intern who smiled politely while her work was stolen wasn't building character or paying dues. She was enabling a toxic system that rewarded theft and punished honesty. I opened my laptop and began typing, not sure exactly what I was writing, but needing to process the day's events somehow. What started as a frustrated journal entry gradually became something more analytical, a detailed account of specific incidents. Where my contributions had been minimized or appropriated, the Henderson proposal was just the most recent example in a pattern that stretched back to my first week at Sterling Dynamics. Writing it all down made the scope of the problem clearer and more infuriating. This wasn't a series of innocent misunderstandings or communication breakdowns. It was deliberate, systematic, and apparently so routine that nobody involved seemed to think there was anything wrong with it. Brandon genuinely appeared to believe that he'd developed the Henderson strategy himself, which suggested that this kind of appropriation happened so regularly that the boundaries between original work and collaborative effort had become completely blurred. The next morning, I arrived at the office with a different kind of energy. Instead of the usual mixture of anxiety and hope that characterized my early mornings at Sterling Dynamics, I felt focused and observational, like a scientist studying an interesting but problematic specimen. I wanted to understand exactly how the system worked, who benefited from it, and where the power actually resided within the organization. My first opportunity came during the weekly team meeting, a gathering of the consulting department that Victoria used to review project statuses and assign new responsibilities. I usually sat in the back and took notes, occasionally being asked to provide updates on administrative tasks or research projects that nobody else wanted to handle. This time, I paid attention to different details. The seating arrangements, which seemed casual, but actually followed a rigid hierarchy with Victoria's favorites occupying positions closest to her chair. The way credit was distributed for successful projects, flowing upward to permanent employees while failures somehow remained attached to temporary staff and interns. The language used to describe different types of work, with strategic thinking, and client development, reserved for certain people while others were limited to research support and administrative assistance. Brandon presented an update on the Henderson Group contract, which had apparently been accepted with enthusiasm and would begin implementation the following month. He spoke with practiced confidence about timeline management and stakeholder coordination, concepts he'd obviously researched thoroughly since the previous day's presentation. Victoria beamed at him like a proud parent, occasionally adding supportive comments about his natural leadership abilities and strategic mindset. When my turn came to provide updates, Victoria's attention immediately shifted to her phone. My report on the Morrison Industries research project was met with distracted nods and a brief, "Good, keep working on that," before the conversation moved on to more important matters. The contrast was so stark that I wondered how I'd ever missed it before. After the meeting, I lingered in the conference room while others filed out, pretending to organize my notes while actually observing the informal conversations that happened once the official business was finished. Victoria and Brandon discussed lunch plans with the casual familiarity of colleagues who'd moved beyond purely professional relationships. David Sterling mentioned a networking event that Brandon might find interesting, along with an offer to provide introductions to potential mentors in the industry. These weren't conversations I'd ever been included in or even aware of until I started paying attention. While I'd been focused on completing assignments and proving my competence through work quality, an entirely separate layer of relationship building and opportunity sharing had been operating around me. It wasn't enough to do good work. You had to be the right kind of person doing good work, and apparently I'd failed some invisible test that determined who qualified for real investment and development. The realization was both painful and liberating. Painful because it confirmed that my struggles weren't due to insufficient effort or capability, but liberating because it meant the problem wasn't something I could fix by working harder or being more agreeable. The system was functioning exactly as intended, and my frustration was a rational response to an irrational situation. Over the following days, I began paying closer attention to how other employees navigated the office environment. There were clear patterns in who got invited to important meetings, whose ideas were implemented, and whose contributions were remembered when it came time for performance reviews and advancement opportunities. The criteria seemed to have less to do with objective performance than with subjective factors like personal chemistry, social connections, and the ability to project confidence in high-pressure situations. I also started noticing the other invisible people in the organization. The administrative assistants who kept everything running smoothly while receiving minimal recognition. The junior analysts whose research formed the foundation of senior-level presentations but whose names never appeared on client materials. The support staff whose institutional knowledge and problem-solving abilities were essential to daily operations, but who were treated as interchangeable resources rather than valuable team members. It was like discovering that I'd been living in a house for months without realizing that most of the rooms were locked, and I'd only been allowed access to the servants' quarters. The real business of Sterling Dynamics happened in spaces and conversations that I'd been systematically excluded from. Not because I lacked the qualifications to participate, but because someone had decided that I didn't belong. The more I understood about the company's actual power structure, the more I thought about my grandfather and what he'd intended when he'd built this organization. Thomas Parker had started with a vision of creating opportunities for talented people to contribute meaningfully to important work. He'd believed in meritocracy and innovation, in the idea that good ideas could come from anywhere and should be implemented regardless of their source. What Sterling Dynamics had become was something entirely different. A hierarchy that reinforced existing advantages while systematically excluding anyone who didn't fit a narrow definition of leadership potential. A place where talent was less important than connections, where innovation was discouraged in favor of maintaining comfortable relationships between people who'd already proven their worth by being selected for inclusion. Looking around the office with this new perspective felt like putting on glasses for the first time. Details that had seemed normal or inevitable suddenly appeared designed and deliberate. The intern program that provided free labor while offering minimal real development opportunities. The promotion processes that seemed to reward visibility over substance. The client relationship management that prioritized personal chemistry over technical expertise. I began keeping detailed notes, not just about my own experiences, but about patterns I observed throughout the organization. Who got credit for successful projects and who was blamed for failures? Which ideas were implemented and which were quietly shelved? How decisions were actually made, as opposed to how they were supposedly made according to official policies and procedures. The picture that emerged was of a company that had drifted far from its founding principles, while maintaining the appearance of innovation and opportunity. The rhetoric about developing talent and embracing new perspectives existed mainly in marketing materials and HR presentations. The actual culture rewarded conformity and punished anyone who challenged existing power structures, even inadvertently. But I was beginning to realize that I had resources available that nobody suspected. The legal documents in my grandmother's safe weren't just historical artifacts. They were tools that could be used to demand accountability from people who'd forgotten that their authority derived from someone else's investment and vision. The question was whether I had the courage to use them, and what kind of person I wanted to become in the process. The answer was starting to become clear, even if the path forward remained uncertain. I'd spent months trying to earn acceptance from people who'd never intended to accept me. Now it was time to stop asking for permission and start demanding the respect that my grandfather's legacy and my own contributions had already earned. The decision to dig deeper came on a Thursday evening when I found myself alone in the office again, ostensibly working late, but actually feeling increasingly restless about my situation. The building's security system required badge access after hours, and I'd discovered that my intern credentials gave me broader access than anyone probably intended. While most employees could only enter their designated floors during business hours, my badge worked throughout the building at any time, likely an oversight from when the security protocols were last updated. I started with the financial records that were stored in the shared database system. My grandfather had taught me basic accounting principles during high school summers when I'd helped him organize his personal investment portfolio, so I understood enough to navigate the company's internal financial reports. What I found there made my stomach turn with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Sterling Dynamics was profitable, extremely so, but the distribution of that success told a story that contradicted everything the leadership claimed about valuing all employees. Executive compensation had increased by 40% over the past 3 years, while support staff salaries had remained essentially flat. The marketing budget for leadership development seemed to exclusively benefit a small circle of favored employees, funding conference attendance, continuing education, and networking events for people like Brandon while ignoring equally qualified candidates who happened to lack the right connections. More troubling were the patterns in client billing. Projects were consistently attributed to senior staff members, regardless of who had actually performed the work, with hours billed at premium rates for executives who had provided minimal oversight, while the actual labor was performed by junior employees and interns whose time was either unbilled or charged at drastically reduced rates. The Henderson Group proposal, for instance, would generate nearly $50,000 in billable hours for Brandon's supposed strategic development work, while my research and analysis contributions were listed as administrative support at a fraction of the cost. The deeper I dug, the more systematic the deception became. Client testimonials on the company website praised innovative solutions and strategic insights that had actually been developed by employees whose names never appeared in the marketing materials. Case studies highlighted breakthrough thinking and market analysis that I could trace back to specific individuals who were still working in junior positions years after their ideas had generated millions in revenue for the company. I began cross-referencing email archives, using the administrative access that came with my data entry responsibilities to search for communications about specific projects and decisions. What I discovered was a pattern of deliberate credit manipulation that went far beyond casual workplace politics. Emails showed explicit instructions to remove certain names from client presentations, to reassign project leadership after the difficult work was completed, and to ensure that public recognition flowed to predetermined recipients regardless of actual contributions. One email chain from 6 months ago was particularly damning. Victoria had written to David Sterling about an innovative supply chain analysis that had saved a major client over $200,000 annually. The original work had been performed by Rachel Kim, a financial analyst who'd been with the company for 3 years, but remained stuck in a mid-level position despite consistently excellent performance. Victoria's email explicitly stated that Rachel's name should be removed from the client presentation because it sends a better message about our senior leadership capabilities if David presents this as his own strategic insight. David's response was even worse. Agreed. Rachel's good at the technical work, but she doesn't have the presence to represent this kind of thinking to C-level executives. Better to keep her focused on the analysis side while we handle client relationships. Rachel's presence. I'd worked with Rachel on several projects, and she was one of the most articulate and knowledgeable people in the entire organization. She understood complex financial systems better than anyone else in the building and could explain intricate concepts with clarity that made difficult topics accessible to non-experts. The only thing different about Rachel's presence was that she was a 30-year-old Asian American woman working in a company dominated by white male executives who apparently couldn't imagine her representing their brand to important clients. The email archives revealed dozens of similar conversations, a systematic pattern of excluding talented employees from opportunities and recognition based on subjective judgments about who looked the part of Sterling Dynamics leadership. Women were consistently described as better suited for behind-the-scenes work, while their ideas were repackaged and presented by male colleagues. Employees of color were praised for their technical skills but deemed lacking in executive presence or client relationship capabilities. Younger staff members were characterized as still developing, regardless of their actual performance or potential. I printed the most egregious examples, building a file that documented not just my own experience, but a company-wide culture of appropriation and discrimination that had been operating for years. The evidence was overwhelming, but I needed to understand the legal and financial structure that enabled this behavior to continue unchecked. That's when I remembered the documents my grandmother had given me, still sitting in a safety deposit box at the bank near my apartment. I'd looked at them briefly after my grandfather's funeral, but at the time they'd seemed like abstract legal paperwork rather than actionable tools. Now they represented something entirely different, proof that the people who'd been systematically excluding me and others were actually employees of a company that I owned. The next Saturday morning, I drove to the bank and retrieved the manila folder that contained my inheritance documentation. Sitting in my car in the parking lot, I spread the papers across my passenger seat and studied them with the focused attention I'd never given them before. Stock certificates, transfer agreements, trust documentation, and most importantly, the corporate charter that established the ownership structure of Sterling Dynamics. Thomas Parker had been meticulous in his record-keeping. Every acquisition of company shares was documented with precision, showing how he'd gradually increased his ownership stake from the initial 30% partnership with David Sterling to the controlling 51% majority he'd held at the time of his death. The trust structure he'd established was complex but clear. Upon his death, ownership would transfer to his designated heir, which was me, with certain conditions about maintaining the company's core mission and values. What shocked me was a clause I'd missed during my initial review of the documents. My grandfather had included specific provisions about employee treatment and advancement opportunities, requiring that the company maintain policies for recognizing contributions regardless of the contributor's position or background. He'd also mandated that ownership changes be disclosed to employees within 90 days of taking effect, which meant that Sterling Dynamics had been operating in violation of its own charter for nearly 2 years. The legal implications were staggering. Not only was I the majority owner of a company that had been systematically stealing my work, but the current leadership had been operating without proper authorization from the actual ownership. Every major decision, every policy change, every financial distribution had been made by people who legally served at my discretion rather than the other way around. I spent the rest of the weekend researching corporate law and fiduciary responsibility, trying to understand exactly what options were available to me. The more I learned, the more I realized that Victoria, David, and the rest of the executive team had been playing a game where they didn't understand the actual rules. They'd been treating Sterling Dynamics like their personal kingdom, unaware that the real authority belonged to someone they'd dismissed as irrelevant. But knowledge without strategy was just frustration waiting to happen. I needed to understand not just what I could do legally, but what approach would actually create the changes I wanted to see. My grandfather hadn't built this company so that I could destroy it in a fit of justified anger. He'd envisioned an organization that would provide opportunities for talented people to contribute meaningfully to important work, and that vision was worth preserving even if the current leadership needed to be completely restructured. Monday morning brought a new perspective to my daily routine at Sterling Dynamics. Walking through the lobby, riding the elevator, sitting. At my assigned desk in the corner of the 15th floor, everything looked the same, but felt completely different. I was no longer the powerless intern hoping for recognition from people who controlled my professional future. I was the majority, owner of the company, temporarily operating undercover while gathering information about how my investment was being managed. The shift in mindset was both exhilarating and unsettling. Every dismissive comment from Victoria, every casual appropriation of my work, every exclusion from important conversations now felt like a direct challenge to my authority rather than just another instance of workplace unfairness. The temptation to immediately assert my ownership and demand explanations was overwhelming, but I knew that revealing my position too early would waste the opportunity to understand the full scope of the problems that needed to be addressed. Instead, I began operating like an investigative journalist working on a long-term exposé. I documented everything, meeting notes that showed how decisions were actually made versus how they were described in official communications, email chains that revealed the gap between public policies and private practices, financial reports that demonstrated how success was attributed and resources were distributed. I photographed documents with my phone, saved digital files to personal cloud storage, and created detailed timelines that tracked specific instances of problematic behavior. The investigation revealed that my situation was just one example of a much larger systemic issue. Sterling Dynamics employed over 200 people across multiple departments, and the patterns of exclusion and appropriation affected employees at every level. The company's public commitment to diversity and inclusion existed mainly in HR presentations and recruiting materials, while the actual culture remained stubbornly resistant to change. I found evidence of qualified candidates being passed over for promotions in favor of less experienced but better connected applicants. Performance reviews that praised technical competence while finding vague deficiencies in leadership potential for employees who didn't fit the traditional executive profile. Training and development opportunities that were offered selectively rather than based on merit or need. Most disturbing was the discovery that several talented employees had left Sterling Dynamics over the past 2 years, citing frustration, with limited advancement opportunities and lack of recognition for their contributions. Exit interview notes revealed complaints about favoritism, credit appropriation, and discriminatory treatment, but these concerns had been dismissed as personality conflicts or unrealistic expectations rather than addressed as institutional problems. Rachel Kim's file was particularly illuminating. Her performance reviews consistently rated her as exceptional in every category, with specific praise for her analytical skills, client communication abilities, and innovative problem-solving approaches. Yet she'd been passed over for 3 separate promotions, each time losing out to male colleagues with less experience and weaker track records. The official justifications cited concerns about her readiness for increased responsibility and need for additional seasoning in client-facing roles. The documentation painted a clear picture of a company that was systematically wasting human talent while concentrating opportunities and recognition among a narrow group of favored employees. My grandfather's vision of meritocratic innovation had been replaced by a culture of cronyism that was not only morally problematic, but also economically inefficient. Sterling Dynamics was succeeding despite its leadership practices rather than because of them, coasting on the foundation Thomas Parker had built while slowly eroding the principles that had made the company successful. Armed with this understanding, I began developing a strategy for change that would go far beyond addressing my personal grievances. The goal wasn't just to gain recognition for my own contributions, but to restore the company to the vision my grandfather had intended when he'd invested his life's work in building it. The first step was ensuring that I had legal standing to act on the evidence I'd gathered. I scheduled a consultation with Marcus Chen, a corporate attorney who specialized in shareholder rights and fiduciary responsibility. His office was located in a sleek downtown building not far from Sterling. Dynamics and meeting with him felt like crossing a threshold into a different kind of professional relationship than anything I'd experienced before. Marcus reviewed my inheritance documentation with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. After nearly an hour of careful analysis, he looked up with an expression that mixed professional excitement with genuine concern. "Lindsay," he said, "you understand that you're not just a majority shareholder here? According to these documents, you have absolute controlling interest in a company that's been operating for 2 years without acknowledging your ownership. That's not just unusual. It's potentially actionable on several different fronts." He explained that the charter violations alone were sufficient grounds for demanding immediate disclosure and governance changes. But the patterns of discrimination and misappropriation I'd documented created additional legal exposure for the current leadership. If I chose to pursue formal action, the consequences for Victoria, David, and others could include personal liability for breach of fiduciary duty, especially given the evidence of deliberate exclusion and credit manipulation. The question, Marcus continued, is what outcome you're actually seeking. Do you want to force immediate leadership changes, pursue financial damages, or try to reform the company culture while maintaining operational continuity? Each approach has different legal requirements and potential consequences. I told him about my grandfather's vision for Sterling Dynamics and my desire to restore the company to its founding principles, rather than simply punish the people who'd lost sight of those values. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, making notes about potential approaches that could achieve systemic change while minimizing disruption to client relationships and employee stability. In that case, he said, I'd recommend a phased approach. We establish your legal authority first, then use that position to demand comprehensive policy changes and accountability measures. The key is demonstrating that you're acting in the company's best interests rather than pursuing personal revenge, which will give us stronger standing if anyone challenges your decisions. We spent another hour discussing specific tactics and timelines, mapping out a strategy that would allow me to reclaim control of Sterling Dynamics while building a case for the changes I wanted to implement. The conversation was unlike anything I'd experienced in my 6 months as an intern. For the first time in months, I was being treated as someone with real authority and legitimate concerns, someone whose vision for the future mattered as much as my ability to execute current assignments. Leaving Marcus's office that afternoon, I felt a combination of nervous energy and focused determination that reminded me of preparing for final exams in college. The difference was that this test would determine not just my own future, but the two professional lives of everyone who worked at Sterling Dynamics. The evidence I'd gathered and the legal authority I possessed gave me the power to demand fundamental changes. But using that power effectively would require careful planning and flawless execution. The next phase of my investigation focused on understanding the financial mechanisms that enabled the current leadership to maintain their positions despite their problematic practices. I needed to know how decisions were actually made, who had influence over policy changes, and what leverage points existed for forcing accountability. What I discovered was that Sterling Dynamics operated with surprisingly little oversight for a company of its size and profitability. The board of directors consisted mainly of David Sterling's personal and professional connections, people who provided minimal scrutiny of executive decisions in exchange for the prestige of board membership at a successful consulting firm. Financial reporting was handled internally, with limited independent auditing of the processes I'd identified as problematic. This lack of oversight had created an environment where questionable practices could continue unchallenged, but it also meant that introducing proper governance structures would be relatively straightforward once I established my legal authority. The same systems that had enabled discrimination and appropriation could be redirected toward transparency and accountability with the right leadership and policies in place. I began drafting a comprehensive plan for reforming Sterling Dynamics, starting with immediate disclosure of the ownership structure and extending through long-term changes in hiring, promotion, and recognition practices. The document grew to over 20 pages as I detailed specific policies for ensuring that contributions were properly attributed, opportunities were distributed fairly, and employee concerns were addressed through formal channels rather than dismissed or ignored. The plan wasn't just about fixing problems, it was about creating the kind of workplace my grandfather had envisioned when he'd started the company. A place where innovation was encouraged regardless of its source, where talent was developed systematically rather than selectively, and where success was measured by contribution rather than politics or personal connections. But implementation would require more than just legal authority and good intentions. I needed allies within the organization, people who understood the problems I'd identified and were willing to support meaningful change even if it disrupted comfortable existing relationships. That meant identifying employees who shared my concerns and could help build consensus for the reforms I wanted to implement. Rachel Kim was the obvious place to start, given her experience with the credit appropriation and advancement barriers I'd documented. But approaching her would require revealing my investigation and potentially my ownership status, which meant crossing a line from passive observation to active intervention. Once I took that step, there would be no returning to my role as the invisible intern who nobody paid attention to. The decision point had arrived, and everything I'd learned over the past weeks had led to this moment. I could continue documenting problems while hoping someone else would eventually address them, or I could use the authority my grandfather had left me to demand the changes that Sterling Dynamics needed. The choice wasn't just about my own career prospects. It was about honoring the vision that had built the company and ensuring that future employees would have opportunities that were based on merit rather than favoritism. Thursday afternoon, I sent Rachel a carefully worded email asking if she'd be available for coffee after work. Her response was immediate and enthusiastic, suggesting that she was as ready for this conversation as I was. The next phase of my plan was about to begin, and for the first time since I'd started working at Sterling Dynamics, I felt like I was moving toward something instead of just enduring what was happening to me. The coffee shop I chose for my meeting with Rachel was deliberately neutral territory, a busy place near the university campus where we could blend into the crowd of students and young professionals grabbing caffeine between classes and meetings. I arrived 15 minutes early, claiming a corner table where we could speak privately without being overheard by anyone who might recognize us from Sterling Dynamics. Rachel appeared precisely on time, her professional demeanor softening into genuine curiosity as she spotted me across the crowded cafe. She looked tired in the way that dedicated employees often do, carrying the weight of responsibilities that extended far beyond her official job description. I'd worked with her on enough projects to know that she regularly stayed late fixing problems that others had created, contributing expertise that was essential to client success while receiving minimal recognition for her efforts. "Lindsay," she said, settling into the chair across from me with a cautious smile. "This is a nice surprise. I have to admit, your email sounded a bit mysterious." I'd rehearsed this conversation multiple times, but sitting across from someone whose career had been systematically undermined by the same people who'd dismissed me made the words feel heavier than I'd anticipated. Rachel deserved to know what I'd discovered, but she also deserved to understand the implications before deciding whether to get involved in what could become a very complicated situation. "Rachel, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me even if the answer is uncomfortable," I began. "Have you ever felt like your contributions at Sterling Dynamics aren't properly recognized, or like opportunities you've earned are being given to other people?" Her expression shifted immediately, the polite professional mask replaced by something more guarded and cautious. She studied my face for a long moment before responding, clearly weighing how much truth she was willing to share with someone she primarily knew as an intern. That's a very specific question, Lindsay. Is this about something that's happening to you? I nodded, choosing my words carefully. It's about something that's been happening to me, and based on some research I've been doing, I think it's happening to other people too. People who deserve better from a company that claims to value innovation and merit. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her expression becoming more serious. What kind of research? That was the opening I'd been hoping for. I pulled out a folder containing copies of the documents I'd gathered, starting with the least sensitive materials and building toward the more damaging evidence. The email chains about removing her name from client presentations, the performance, reviews that praised her work while finding excuses to deny promotions. The billing records that showed her analysis being charged to clients at premium rates while being attributed to senior executives. As Rachel reviewed the documents, her expression moved through surprise, anger, and finally a kind of grim recognition. She wasn't shocked by what she was seeing, which told me that she'd suspected these problems existed, but hadn't been able to prove them. "How did you get access to these files?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "That's complicated to explain, but I have legitimate access to company records in my roles supporting various departments. What I discovered is that the patterns we've both experienced aren't isolated incidents. They're systematic practices that affect multiple employees across the organization." I showed her additional examples from other departments, being careful not to reveal the full scope of my investigation, but providing enough evidence to demonstrate that the problems went far beyond individual personality conflicts or communication issues. The data painted a clear picture of an organization that was systematically undervaluing talented employees while concentrating opportunities among a narrow group of favored individuals. Rachel studied the documents with the analytical intensity she brought to financial reports, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and context. When she finally looked up, her expression was thoughtful but cautious. "Lindsay, this is serious documentation of some very problematic practices. But I have to ask what you're planning to do with this information, and more importantly, what you're hoping I'll do with it." That was the question I'd been preparing for, and the answer would determine whether Rachel became an ally or decided to distance herself from what could become a very messy situation. I needed her to understand that I wasn't asking her to jeopardize her career for the sake of principle, but that I had resources and authority that could protect both of us while demanding meaningful change. "Rachel, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to hear me out completely before you respond." I paused, studying her face to gauge her readiness for what came next. "I'm not just an intern at Sterling Dynamics. I'm the majority owner of the company." The silence that followed was profound. Rachel stared at me with an expression that moved through disbelief, confusion, and gradually toward something that might have been understanding. She glanced down at the documents spread across our table, then back at my face, as if trying to reconcile the young woman she'd known as a hardworking intern with the person claiming to own the company where they both worked. "I'm going to need you to explain that statement," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled. I told her about my grandfather, Thomas Parker, about the inheritance documents I'd discovered after his death, and about the trust structure that had transferred majority ownership to me without the knowledge of Sterling Dynamics' current leadership. I explained how I'd applied for the internship without revealing my connection to the company, hoping to understand the business from the ground up before taking any formal role in its management. "So when Victoria called you just an intern in that meeting," Rachel said slowly, "she was actually dismissing the person who owns 51% of the company she works for." "Exactly. And when David Sterling talks about his vision for the company's future, he's making plans for an organization that legally belongs to someone else, someone who's been watching how they treat employees and clients, and who's not impressed with what she's seen." Rachel was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of what I'd revealed. When she spoke again, her voice carried a mixture of amazement and concern. "Lindsay, if what you're telling me is true, then you have the authority to fire everyone who's been treating us badly and completely restructure the company. Why are you sitting in a coffee shop asking for my help instead of walking into Victoria's office and demanding explanations?" That was the heart of the matter, and my answer would determine whether Rachel understood my intentions and was willing to support the approach I wanted to take. Because firing everyone and starting over would destroy the good things about Sterling Dynamics along with the bad things. My grandfather built this company to provide opportunities for talented people to do meaningful work, and that vision is worth preserving. But it needs to be implemented properly, with systems and policies that ensure fair treatment and recognition for everyone who contributes. I outlined my plan for reforming Sterling Dynamics, starting with disclosure of the ownership structure, and extending through comprehensive changes in hiring, promotion, and recognition practices. The goal wasn't to punish people for past mistakes, but to create accountability mechanisms that would prevent similar problems in the future. I need allies within the organization, I continued, people who understand what's been happening and can help build support for meaningful change. You've experienced these problems firsthand, and you have credibility with other employees who've been affected. Your voice would carry weight in ways that mine might not, especially initially. Rachel listened thoughtfully, occasionally asking questions about specific aspects of the plan and the legal authority that supported it. Her background in financial analysis made her particularly interested in the governance and oversight mechanisms I proposed, and she offered several suggestions for ensuring that policy changes would be implemented effectively rather than just existing on paper. "There's something else you should know," she said eventually. "I've been documenting my own experiences for the past year, keeping records of conversations and decisions that seemed problematic. I wasn't sure what I'd ever do with that information, but I had a feeling it might be important someday." She described a file she'd compiled containing performance reviews, email communications, and notes from meetings where her contributions had been minimized or appropriated. The documentation paralleled what I'd discovered through my investigation, providing additional evidence of the systematic nature of the problems we'd identified. "If we're going to do this," Rachel said, "we need to be prepared for the possibility that Victoria and David will fight back. They've built their careers on the current system, and they're not going to accept change willingly. We need to anticipate their responses and have strategies for addressing resistance." That conversation led to a detailed discussion of potential obstacles and how to overcome them. Victoria's tendency to frame criticism as disloyalty or insufficient understanding of business realities. David's habit of making promises about future changes while avoiding concrete commitments to specific reforms. The broader challenge of changing a culture that had operated according to certain assumptions for years. We spent nearly 3 hours in that coffee shop, developing a strategy that would leverage my legal authority while building internal support for the changes we wanted to implement. By the time we parted ways, I had gained not just an ally, but a strategic partner who understood both the problems and the potential solutions. The next step was assembling additional support within the organization. Rachel suggested approaching Helen Rodriguez, a board member who'd occasionally raised questions about employee development and advancement practices during quarterly meetings. Helen had a background in organizational psychology and might be sympathetic to arguments about improving company culture and operational efficiency. I also decided to reach out to several other employees who'd been affected by the credit appropriation and advancement barriers I documented. Building a coalition of people with first-hand experience of these problems would demonstrate that reform wasn't just about my personal grievances, but about creating systemic changes that would benefit the entire organization. The process of identifying and approaching potential allies was delicate work that required careful judgment about who could be trusted with sensitive information and who had the influence to support meaningful change. Some conversations would happen immediately, while others would need to wait until after I'd established my legal authority more formally. Meanwhile, I began working with Marcus Chen to prepare the legal documents that would formally assert my ownership and demand disclosure of my role in company governance. The paperwork was complex, involving corporate charter provisions, shareholder rights, and fiduciary responsibilities that had been ignored for nearly 2 years. Marcus recommended a phased approach that would give Sterling Dynamics leadership time to adjust to the new reality while ensuring that changes happened quickly enough to address ongoing problems. The first phase would involve private disclosure to Victoria and David, giving them an opportunity to cooperate with reform efforts before any public announcements were made. The key, Marcus explained, is demonstrating that you're acting in the company's best interests rather than pursuing personal revenge. If they cooperate with reasonable demands for transparency and accountability, everyone benefits. If they resist or retaliate, you have stronger grounds for more dramatic interventions. By Thursday of that week, I had assembled a comprehensive package of evidence, legal documentation, and reform proposals that would serve as the foundation for demanding change at Sterling Dynamics. The investigation phase was complete, and the time had come to transition from passive observation to active intervention. The confrontation I'd been building toward would happen the following Monday, when I would walk into Victoria's office with documents that would fundamentally alter her understanding of who held authority at Sterling Dynamics. Everything I'd experienced as an intern, every dismissive comment and appropriated contribution, had led to this moment when the balance of power would shift dramatically and permanently. But first, I wanted to spend the weekend preparing for every possible response and ensuring that I was ready to handle whatever came next. This wasn't just about personal vindication. It was about honoring my grandfather's vision and creating the kind of workplace that talented people deserved. The stakes were too high to leave anything to chance. Friday evening, I drove to my grandmother's house in the suburbs, carrying the inheritance documents that had started this entire journey. She was waiting for me with tea and homemade cookies, the same combination she'd offered during childhood visits when I'd needed comfort or advice. "You look different, sweetheart," she said as I settled into the familiar armchair across from her kitchen table. More confident, maybe, or more determined. I told her about what I'd discovered at Sterling Dynamics and the plans I'd developed for using my ownership authority to demand change. She listened with the focused attention she'd always given to serious conversations, occasionally asking questions that helped clarify my thinking about specific challenges or approaches. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said when I finished, explaining the situation. He always believed that real leadership meant taking responsibility for making things better, even when it would be easier to just accept the way things are. But he also believed in being strategic about change, in building consensus rather than just imposing solutions. She shared stories about Thomas Parker's approach to business challenges, emphasizing his preference for collaboration and his skill at finding solutions that addressed underlying problems rather than just treating symptoms. His success had come from understanding that sustainable change required buy-in from everyone affected, not just compliance from people who disagreed with new policies. "Remember," my grandmother said as I prepared to leave, "you're not just changing a company. You're honoring a legacy and creating opportunities for people who deserve them. That's work worth doing, no matter how difficult it becomes." Driving home that evening, I felt the weight of responsibility that came with the authority I was about to exercise. Monday morning would bring conversations that would alter the trajectory of Sterling Dynamics and everyone who worked there. The question wasn't whether I had the legal right to demand change, but whether I had the wisdom and skill to implement it effectively. The weekend passed slowly, filled with final preparations and mental rehearsals of conversations that would determine the future of an organization my grandfather had spent decades building. By Sunday night, I was ready to stop being the invisible intern and start being the owner of Sterling Dynamics. The transformation would begin with a single meeting, but its effects would reshape everything that followed. Monday morning arrived with an energy that felt electric and inevitable. I dressed carefully, choosing the navy blazer I'd worn to my first day at Sterling Dynamics 6 months ago. But this time it felt like armor rather than a costume I was trying on for size. The documents Marcus Chen had prepared sat in a leather portfolio beside me on the passenger seat. Officially notarized papers that would transform every relationship and assumption within the company before noon. I arrived at the office early, as had become my habit, but instead of heading to my usual workstation on the 15th floor, I took the elevator directly to 17. The executive level looked different in morning light, less intimidating, and more like what it actually was: office space that belonged to me, occupied by people who worked for a company I owned. Victoria's assistant wasn't at her desk yet, which gave me the opportunity to walk directly to the corner office where Sterling Dynamics' supposed CEO conducted the business of an organization she'd never actually controlled. I knocked twice, and entered without waiting for permission, carrying myself with the confidence of someone who had every right to be there. Victoria looked up from her computer screen with the startled annoyance of someone interrupted during important work. She was impeccably dressed, as always, her appearance projecting the kind of professional authority that had intimidated me for months. Today, however, I saw something different in her carefully maintained composure. The brittle confidence of someone whose position depended on others not asking too many questions about how she'd obtained it. "Lindsay," she said, her voice carrying the patient exasperation she reserved for inconvenient interruptions. "I wasn't expecting you. Is there something urgent that needs my attention?" I closed the door behind me and took the seat across from her desk without being invited. The gesture was small but significant, a signal that this conversation would proceed according to different rules than any we'd had before. "Victoria, we need to discuss your role at Sterling Dynamics and some concerning practices that have come to my attention regarding employee treatment and project attribution." Her eyebrows raised in what appeared to be genuine surprise mixed with irritation. "Lindsay, I'm not sure what you think you've discovered, but as an intern, you're not in a position to evaluate company practices or question executive decisions. If you have concerns about your experience here, there are appropriate channels for feedback that don't involve disrupting my schedule." I opened the leather portfolio and removed the first set of documents, placing them on her desk where she could see the official letterhead and legal formatting. "Actually, Victoria, I am in a position to evaluate company practices. In fact, I'm in the only position that ultimately matters when it comes to Sterling Dynamics' future direction." She glanced down at the papers, her expression shifting from annoyance toward confusion as she recognized the corporate charter documentation and ownership transfer agreements. I watched her face carefully as she processed what she was seeing, the moment when professional irritation gave way to something much more unsettling. "These appear to be ownership documents," she said slowly, her voice taking on a different quality as she struggled to understand what was happening. "But I don't understand why you're showing them to me." "Because they establish that I am the majority shareholder of Sterling Dynamics, holding 51% ownership through a trust established by my grandfather, Thomas Parker. The man who actually founded this company and whose investment made everything you see around you possible." The silence that followed was profound. Victoria stared at the documents, then at me, then back at the papers, as if hoping they might reveal a different message upon closer inspection. I could see her mind working furiously, trying to reconcile the young woman she'd dismissed as just an intern with the legal authority represented by the papers in front of her. "That's impossible," she said finally. "David Sterling founded this company. I've worked here for 8 years, and Thomas Parker was just a consultant who occasionally visited the office. He never had any ownership stake." I removed additional documents from the portfolio, including the original partnership agreement between Thomas Parker and David Sterling that clearly showed my grandfather's controlling investment in the company's founding. Bank records demonstrated the source of funding for initial operations, office leases, and early employee salaries. Corporate filings proved the gradual increase in Thomas Parker's ownership stake over the years, reaching majority control, well before Victoria had even been hired. David Sterling was a junior partner who contributed his industry connections and client development skills, I explained, my voice remaining calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. My grandfather provided the capital, strategic, vision, and business expertise that allowed Sterling Dynamics to grow from a small consulting practice into the organization it is today. What David failed to mention during his various speeches about company history is that he never owned more than 30% of the business. Victoria studied the documentation with increasing alarm, her professional composure beginning to crack as she realized the implications of what I was showing her. Even if this is accurate, why are you telling me now? What do you want? That was the question I'd been preparing for, and my answer would determine whether this conversation led to collaborative reform or adversarial conflict. I leaned forward, slightly, maintaining eye contact as I outlined the situation with clarity and purpose. What I want is for Sterling Dynamics to operate according to the principles my grandfather established when he built this company. Principles that prioritize merit over politics, innovation over favoritism, and fair treatment over personal preferences. Over the past 6 months, I've documented systematic practices that violate these principles and undermine the success that generations of employees have worked to achieve. I presented the evidence I'd compiled. Email chains showing deliberate credit appropriation, performance reviews that penalize talented employees for subjective failings, billing practices that misrepresented the source of client deliverables, and advancement decisions that consistently favored personal connections over demonstrated competence. Victoria's face went through several color changes as she reviewed the materials, recognizing her own communications and seeing patterns she'd probably never considered from an outside perspective. The case was overwhelming, but more importantly, it was undeniable. Every document was authentic, every example was verifiable, and the systemic nature of the problems was impossible to dismiss as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. "I don't understand what you expect me to do with this information," she said, her voice now carrying a defensive edge that suggested she was beginning to understand the gravity of her situation. "I expect you to cooperate with immediate and comprehensive reforms that will restore Sterling Dynamics to its founding principles, starting with acknowledgement of my ownership role and commitment to transparent, merit-based policies for all aspects of employee treatment and advancement." Before Victoria could respond, I heard voices in the outer office indicating that David Sterling had arrived for their usual Monday morning strategy meeting. Perfect timing for the conversation I'd been planning to have with both of them simultaneously. "David should be part of this discussion," I said, standing to open the office door. "These changes affect the entire leadership structure." David entered the office with his typical Monday morning energy, carrying a coffee cup and already discussing quarterly projections before he noticed the document spread across Victoria's desk and the unusual tension in the room. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking between Victoria's pale face and my composed expression with growing concern. "Lindsay has some documents she'd like us to review," Victoria said carefully, her voice betraying the strain of trying to maintain normalcy in an impossible situation. I gestured for David to take a seat, then provided him with a summary of the ownership documentation and evidence of problematic practices I'd already shared with Victoria. Watching his face as he processed the information was like watching someone realize that the ground beneath their feet had never been as solid as they'd believed. "This can't be right," he said, his voice carrying less conviction than his words suggested. "I founded Sterling Dynamics. I built this company from nothing. Thomas Parker was an investor, yes, but he was never involved in day-to-day operations." "That's correct," I replied. "My grandfather deliberately chose to remain in the background, allowing you to serve as the public face of the company while he provided the capital and strategic guidance that made growth possible. But maintaining a low profile doesn't change the legal reality of ownership. And it certainly doesn't authorize the kind of practices that have become routine under your leadership. I watched David's expression shift as he began to understand the implications of my presence and authority. The company he'd considered his personal domain was actually controlled by someone else. Someone who'd been watching and documenting everything while he and Victoria had treated her as irrelevant. "What do you want from us?" David asked, echoing Victoria's earlier question, but with the resignation of someone who was beginning to accept an unpleasant new reality. "I want Sterling Dynamics to become the kind of company my grandfather envisioned when he invested his life's work in building it. That means immediate implementation of transparent policies for project attribution, fair procedures for advancement and recognition, and accountability mechanisms that ensure these problems don't continue." I outlined specific reforms: mandatory, disclosure of contribution sources on all client deliverables, structured advancement processes based on objective criteria, regular auditing of promotion and recognition decisions, and formal channels for employees to report concerns about treatment or fairness without fear of retaliation. These changes will be implemented immediately, I continued, with progress monitored by external consultants who specialize in organizational culture and employment practices. Compliance isn't optional, and resistance will result in immediate termination for cause. The phrase termination for cause hung in the air like a sword, reminding both Victoria and David that their continued employment depended on cooperation with reforms they might prefer to avoid. Neither of them spoke for several minutes, processing the complete reversal of power dynamics that had just occurred. Victoria was the first to break the silence. "Lindsay, I want you to know that any problems you've experienced were never intentional. If there have been misunderstandings about credit or recognition, we can certainly address those through normal channels. I appreciated the attempt at damage control, but the evidence I'd gathered made it impossible to characterize systematic discrimination as innocent misunderstanding. Victoria, the documentation I've shown you demonstrates patterns that extended far beyond my personal experience. This isn't about individual incidents that can be resolved with apologies. It's about institutional practices that require structural change." David leaned forward, his expression shifting toward what might have been negotiation mode. "What if we established a task force to review policies and recommend improvements? We could bring in outside consultants to evaluate our practices and suggest modifications that address your concerns." The offer was reasonable on its surface, but I'd spent enough time observing Sterling Dynamics' leadership to recognize the strategy. Create a process that appeared responsive while ensuring that actual change could be delayed, diluted, or derailed through committee dynamics and competing priorities. "David, the time for task forces and gradual improvement has passed. The evidence I've presented documents violations of both company charter provisions and employment law that create immediate liability for Sterling Dynamics and personal exposure for anyone who continues these practices." I removed the final set of documents from my portfolio, including Marcus Chen's legal analysis of fiduciary responsibility and the potential consequences for executives who failed to address documented discrimination and fraud. The implications were clear. Cooperation with reform efforts was not just morally appropriate, but legally necessary. I've prepared comprehensive policy changes that will be implemented within 30 days, I continued. During that period, we'll also conduct a complete review of past decisions regarding advancement, recognition, and project attribution, with corrections made where appropriate. Employees who have been affected by previous practices will receive acknowledgement and, where applicable, compensation for contributions that were improperly attributed to others. The scope of what I was proposing clearly overwhelmed both Victoria and David. They exchanged glances that conveyed the shared understanding that their comfortable world of unquestioned authority and convenient credit appropriation was ending permanently. "Lindsay," Victoria said slowly, "implementing changes this quickly could disrupt client relationships and confuse employees who are accustomed to current procedures. Perhaps we could develop a more gradual transition plan that achieves the same goals with less operational disruption. I recognized the appeal to practicality as another attempt to delay meaningful change, but I also understood that some aspects of reform would indeed require careful planning to avoid unintended consequences. The key was distinguishing between legitimate implementation concerns and resistance disguised as logistical caution. Certain changes will be immediate and non-negotiable, I replied. Starting today, all project attribution must accurately reflect actual contributions, and any employee concerns about treatment or fairness will be directed to external consultants rather than handled internally. Other reforms will be phased in over the next month, with specific timelines and accountability measures that ensure progress continues regardless of competing priorities. Over the next hour, we worked through the details of implementation, addressing practical concerns while maintaining the fundamental requirements for change. Victoria and David gradually shifted from shock and resistance toward reluctant acceptance, recognizing that cooperation offered them the best chance of preserving their positions within the reformed organization. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door, followed by the entrance of Brandon Walsh, who'd apparently arrived for a scheduled meeting that no one had thought to cancel. His confident smile faltered as he took in the scene. Victoria looking shaken, David appearing defeated, and me sitting at the conference table surrounded by legal documents. "Is this a bad time?" he asked, his eyes moving between the three of us with growing confusion. "I can come back later if you're in the middle of something important." "Actually, Brandon, your timing is perfect," I said, gesturing for him to join us. "We're discussing changes in project attribution policies that will affect everyone in the consulting department." Brandon took a seat, his expression showing the careful attention he brought to conversations with senior leadership. He had no way of knowing that the power dynamics in the room had shifted completely, or that the intern he'd barely acknowledged was now setting policy for the entire organization. "Brandon," I continued, "I need you to understand that effective immediately, all project deliverables must include accurate attribution for research, analysis, and strategic development. The Henderson Group proposal, for instance, will need to be corrected to reflect the actual sources of the market analysis and implementation strategy." The color drained from Brandon's face as he realized that someone had discovered the gap between his presentation and his actual contribution. He looked toward Victoria for support, but found only silence and averted eyes. "I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting," he said carefully. "The Henderson proposal was a collaborative effort, and I coordinated the various inputs into a coherent strategic framework. Brandon, I have documentation of the actual work performed on that project, including timestamps for research completion and analysis development. Coordination is certainly valuable, but it doesn't justify taking primary credit for work performed by others." The next few minutes were uncomfortable but necessary, as Brandon gradually understood that his career advancement at Sterling Dynamics would now depend on his actual contributions rather than his ability to appropriate credit from colleagues. Victoria and David watched the conversation with obvious discomfort, recognizing that similar reckonings awaited other employees who'd benefited from the company's previous attribution practices. By the end of the morning, I had established my authority, outlined comprehensive reforms, and secured commitments from Sterling Dynamics leadership to implement immediate changes in policy and practice. The transformation wasn't complete, but the foundation was set for creating the kind of workplace my grandfather had envisioned when he'd invested in Thomas Parker's vision. The following weeks brought challenges and adjustments as Sterling Dynamics adapted to its new reality. Some employees embraced the changes enthusiastically, particularly those who'd been overlooked or undervalued under previous policies. Others struggled with accountability measures that required them to justify their contributions and acknowledge the work of colleagues they'd previously ignored. Rachel Kim was promoted to senior financial analyst with increased responsibilities for strategic planning and client relationship management. Her insights and analytical skills, previously hidden behind more senior colleagues, became visible throughout the organization as attribution policies ensured proper recognition for her contributions. Victoria remained as CEO but under significantly changed circumstances, with her authority now explicitly derived from company ownership rather than assumed through historical precedent. The adjustment was difficult for someone accustomed to unquestioned decision-making power, but she gradually adapted to collaborative leadership and transparent communication. David's role evolved toward business development and client relations, areas where his networking skills and industry knowledge provided genuine value. Freed from the pressure of maintaining the fiction that he'd founded and built Sterling Dynamics, alone, he became more effective at the work he was actually qualified to perform. 6 months after that Monday morning confrontation, Sterling Dynamics had become the kind of company that attracted and retained exceptional talent while delivering innovative solutions for complex client challenges. Employee satisfaction surveys showed dramatic improvements in recognition, advancement opportunities, and workplace culture. Client relationships strengthened as projects reflected diverse perspectives and collaborative expertise rather than individual ego management. I maintained my official role as majority owner while continuing to work within the organization, now as a strategic development associate rather than an intern. The position allowed me to contribute meaningfully to company growth while ensuring that reforms continued to be implemented effectively rather than gradually abandoned as memories of the transition period faded. The personal satisfaction of seeing talented colleagues receive appropriate recognition for their contributions was matched by the professional pride of knowing that Sterling Dynamics was fulfilling its founding mission. Innovation flourished when diverse voices were heard and valued. Client outcomes improved when the best ideas were implemented regardless of their source. Company culture became genuinely collaborative rather than performatively hierarchical. Standing in my grandfather's former office, now converted into a collaborative workspace where teams could develop strategies and solutions together, I thought about the journey from invisible intern to company owner. The transformation hadn't been easy for anyone involved, but it had been necessary for creating an organization worthy of the vision and investment that had made it possible. Thomas Parker had built Sterling Dynamics to provide opportunities for talented people to contribute meaningfully to important work. 6 months ago, that vision had been obscured by politics and favoritism that rewarded appearance over substance. Today, it was a reality that honored both the legacy of its founder and the potential of everyone who worked to advance its mission. The phone on my desk buzzed with a message from Rachel, now leading a team that was developing breakthrough strategies for sustainable business practices. Lindsay, can you review the Morrison Industries proposal before we submit it? I want to make sure we're properly attributing the regulatory analysis work. I smiled, remembering when such consideration would have been unthinkable at Sterling Dynamics. The changes we'd implemented weren't just about fairness or legal compliance. They were about creating an environment where excellence could emerge from anywhere and be recognized honestly. That was the kind of company worth building, and worth the effort required to transform it from what it had been into what it could become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.